Today is August 13th, 2025, and I'm William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If you'd like to learn about the work we do in making real classical Catholic education available for students of all ages, visit our website at classicalliberarts.com. I'd love to have you join us for studies, and hopefully after today's talk, you'll understand more of what these studies are about. When I was in college studying classics and ancient history at Rutgers University in New Jersey, I took a course in educational philosophy, a course that would end up changing my life. The course was taught by an old, retired professor, Dr. Adam Skrupski, who became a mentor and a great friend to me. He was the source of my interest in education, and it all started one day in class when he asked the class this question: what would you fix in modern education? What would you fix in modern education? I sat and listened as my classmates made their comments and suggestions, and I could tell that the professor wasn't impressed. He wasn't happy with the answers that the students were offering. He was looking for something that they weren't giving him. So I raised my hand, kind of annoyed at this waste of time, and I asked, how can anyone talk about what needs to be fixed in education without ever establishing the end for which education even exists? That was my response. And as I said that, his eyes lit up and he smiled at me. That's what he was looking for. He was looking for a discussion on the ends of education. And you can see how my classmates, they didn't even begin by establishing the ends of education. They just started talking about what they thought should be done and what their preferred methods and means might be, which is irrational. I was frustrated because I knew that if we didn't establish the goal or the ends of education, any discussion of means and ways was a waste of time. And my professor, seeing that I understood that, decided to take me under his wing, and he invested in me. Really, amazingly, at that time in my life, he invited me to his office. He gave me books from his own bookshelves. He invited me to his home to meet his wife and discuss education, even paid for me to join him at an educational conference because he wanted to introduce me to some other leaders in educational philosophy. He became a friend to me because I asked the question, what are the ends of education? That to him was the sign that I was going to be successful. But I wasn't interested in education. I was a classicist. I was interested in classical studies. I was considering at the time still being a Protestant, a life in Christian ministry. But he persuaded me through our conversations of the importance of working in education. And that's where my educational career and my interest in education began. He even wrote me a letter of recommendation that allowed me to get a full-time teaching job before I had my undergraduate degree. Really changed my life. I owe all of my interest in education to Dr. Skrupski, and my wife and I talk about him all the time. And that topic we discussed that day what are the ends of education, I'd like to take up that discussion 30 years later, because I think it's more important than ever. And at this point in my life, now being 50 years old, I've got some pretty clear ideas as to what the answer to that question is. And that's what I'd like to talk about. What are the ends, the real ends of education? If we go back into history, again, I'm a classicist and a historian, so I like to begin by just thinking through history. The virtuous pagan philosophers, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and so on, they were interested in many topics, obviously, but their main topic of interest, because they were truly good men, their main topic of interest was human happiness. Socrates, for all of his fame, and remember when we read the dialogues of Plato, that those are dialogues that Plato wrote. Those are not recorded dialogues of Socrates. Socrates was really a moral philosopher. If you read any historian, any good old historian on philosophy, he will identify Socrates as a moral philosopher. Socrates was seeking to establish true ethics. Plato's philosophy, and if you don't know, Plato was taught and influenced by Socrates. Plato also focused on questions of justice and happiness. That's the theme of his most famous work, The Republic. And then Aristotle, who was taught and influenced by Plato, but who disagreed with Plato in some important issues. Aristotle taught that every action and every art, all human actions, are ordered toward some good, and that the highest good for man is virtue, which he defined as happiness. So for Aristotle, the intellect naturally seeks to know what is true, and the will seeks what is good. And so here we have these two ends, the end of the intellect and the end of the human will. And I really want you to get that into your mind. We have the human intellect and we have the human will. These are really the two powers of our soul that make us like God, that make us human beings. We have intellect and will. The perfection of the intellect is truth, and the perfection of the will is goodness. Again, the perfection of the human intellect is truth, and the perfection of the human will is goodness. These are the ends of the human life, truth and goodness. Thomas Aquinas takes this even further and explains that truth, to be more specific, as you know, St. Thomas likes to be, truth is the conformity of the intellect to reality. In other words, our minds agree with what is actually real. The conformity of the intellect to reality, that's truth according to St. Thomas. And goodness is the perfection of anything according to its nature. So whatever God created a thing to be, when a thing becomes complete, that is, when it becomes everything that it was intended to be, that's what it means to be good. So truth is the conformity of the intellect to reality, or the agreement of the intellect with reality, and goodness is the perfection of a thing according to its nature. And so for man, made in the image and likeness of God, truth perfects the intellect, and goodness perfects the will. The end of man, therefore, is to know the truth, which, as Christians, we learn is God Himself. A profound idea. The end of man is to know the truth, that is God, and to love the good, which again is God. Truth and goodness are the end of human nature, the perfection of human nature, and both of them are found in God Himself, who is, capital G, goodness. God is the good. God is the good that the human soul, that human nature seeks. Truth and goodness, both of which are found in God, these are the ends of man. And so from this perspective, when we consider what man is, what man's nature is, and we're not talking about some men, we're not talking about the wealthy, we're not talking about the privileged, we're not talking about a certain race of people or certain group of people, certain socioeconomic class. We're talking about human beings. I can go even further and say we're not talking about Christians, we're not talking about Catholics, we're not talking about Judeo-Christian people. No, we're talking about human beings. The end of human life is truth and goodness together because they're inseparable. And so when we think about this idea of goodness that St. Thomas described so clearly, that goodness is essentially the perfection of a thing, we see that that's really the purpose of education. In education, we're seeking to help a person become perfect. And that's literally a fulfillment of Christ's command to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And so as parents, we're seeking to help our children become perfect. Our priests are seeking to help us become perfect. As teachers, our work is to help our children become perfect. And by perfect, we don't mean immaculate, don't mean impeccable, because those things are impossible. What we mean by perfect is complete. We seek to lead our students to simply become fully human, to be perfect humans, to be complete humans. And they become such when they approach and arrive at truth and goodness. So we can say that the true ends of education are truth and goodness when understood in this Aristotelian or scholastic sense. The ends of education, the answer to that question I asked in my educational philosophy class, what are the ends or the goals of education? The answer is truth and goodness. And so we see how this leads us to the old catechism question when we asked, why did God make us? God made us to know Him, to love Him, and to serve Him. And you can see right there, truth and goodness, the knowledge of God, the love and service of God, and to enjoy Him forever, to be with Him, to be happy with Him forever. That's the end of man. That's why God made us. And when we fulfill that end, when we attain to that purpose, we become good. That's what it means to be good. So the purpose of true education is to lead man, a rational creature, to intellectual and moral perfection. The purpose is to form the mind to know the truth and to form the will to love the good, so that man may serve God in this life and enjoy Him forever in the next. So that's, we could say, the end of education: to know the truth and to love the good. And because man is a rational creature, his perfection depends on the proper development of the intellect and the will. The intellect is perfected by the knowledge of truth, and the will is perfected by the pursuit of the good. Education exists to guide this process from childhood to maturity, and it's important to emphasize both ends of this process, from childhood, from the very beginning, all the way to the very end. If I were to ask you today, are you perfect? If your answer to that question is no, then you need education. The purpose of education is to lead man to perfection. In the Catholic tradition, this means leading the intellect from basic knowledge of elementary things, such as language and number, to lead man, to lead this rational soul through this system of increasingly complex ideas and concepts, beginning with language and number, through the liberal arts, the classical liberal arts, to the study of philosophy and theology. We see this ascent of human learning, beginning with the most basic of the classical liberal arts, namely grammar and arithmetic, and ascending from grammar into reasoning, and from reasoning to rhetoric, and from arithmetic into music and geometry and astronomy. And then from those 7 arts up into the study of the philosophical sciences, learning what has already been investigated and discovered by wise men who lived before us, while also adding to that our own investigation, continuing that investigation and answering problems that remain or new problems that emerge. At every stage, the goal is not simply to accumulate information, which we call encyclopedic learning. That's an error of modern education. It's not to accumulate information. It's also not simply to develop skills, to be useful or utilitarian. The purpose of education, human education, is to order the soul or direct the soul towards its highest and ultimate end, which is union with God Himself, to bring the soul home to God. That's the ultimate purpose of education. Quite a noble pursuit. And you can see how, as I began to learn, what I learned from Dr. Skrupski, was the most elementary level of this educational philosophy. But while I didn't understand all that was to be learned, again, I wasn't even a Catholic at the time, I knew what I needed to know, and I knew the direction, and I had a general sense of what I needed to learn and do. And over the course of my teaching career, I've worked to clarify that, and you see the fruit of that work in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Thomas Aquinas, again, explains that this ordering is both natural and supernatural. By nature, by man's own natural abilities or potential, man seeks truth and goodness to a degree. But by grace, grace builds upon nature. And by grace, man is elevated to the supernatural end of eternal life. The end of man is beyond man. The end of man is supernatural. And God's grace builds upon human nature. When we look back to, as I said, the virtuous pagans, we find men who all but exhausted the limits of human nature. When we look at the writings of Aristotle, for example, we look and say, this man exhausted the limits of human reason. What more could he possibly have done? And when we look to many of the virtuous pagans again, like the Stoics, we see men who really exhausted the limits of human goodness as far as human natural ability can reach. They were men who had exhausted themselves in the pursuit of truth and goodness. And this was before Christianity. And yet Christianity brought something greater. In the Gospel of John, we read, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. When Christ came into the world, he came into the world to enable man to fulfill his end. He brought with him the truth and the grace that man needed to become perfect, to fulfill his end, and to glorify God. By grace, man is elevated to eternal life, the supernatural end for which he was created. And so a complete education, a complete human education, must prepare man for both life in this world and the life in the world to come. It must prepare men for their end. That's the true end of education. Note that there's only one human nature, there's only one end for man, and therefore there can only be one true system of education. And fortunately, the ancients worked to figure out what that system consists of. And that study and work continued into the Christian era through medieval times. Men working to figure out how, by means of education, man could be brought to the perfection of his nature, to the end for which he was created. And not by human ability alone, as St. Paul says, not by words of human wisdom alone, but by nature and by grace. And we see this in ancient history before Christianity and in medieval Christianity after the founding of the Christian Church. Ancient Greek and Roman education, if we go back into the ancient world, ancient Greek and Roman education aimed at forming a virtuous citizen, a citizen capable of acting justly in the community, but also one capable of contemplating higher truths. They weren't utilitarian. They weren't concerned only with what Solomon called life under the sun. They were very concerned with life beyond this life. They were raising men to live justly in the community, but also to contemplate things beyond this life. The classical liberal arts were discovered and developed by these ancient men to provide the tools for thinking, reasoning, and speaking well of God. And if you don't think that the ancients knew a great deal of truth about God, you're wrong. It's very common for arrogant Christians today to mock the ancients without thinking of the circumstances in which they came to know, and by what efforts they came to know what they eventually published as their teaching on the nature of God, teaching which Aquinas simply absorbs into Christian doctrine. That's how good it was. But the liberal arts, the 7 liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, they provided the tools for thinking, reasoning, and speaking well. Philosophy trained the mind to seek wisdom, established the sciences, investigated the different subjects. And philosophy also, in terms of moral philosophy, guided men to live according to reason, to think, and to act according to wise deliberation or prudence. The ancient world figured that out and did that. And then in the Middle Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity, the Catholic Church took this ancient structure, this ancient system of education, and they brought it to even greater perfection. The trivium and the quadrivium, the divisions of the 7 liberal arts, prepared students for philosophy, and philosophy prepared students for the highest subject of all, theology. A subject that the ancients really couldn't attain to because the knowledge of God, being beyond our nature, beyond our reach, beyond the reach of human reason, required divine revelation. We needed God to reveal himself to us. And the study of what God has revealed of himself to us is the study of theology, the science of God. That was only possible by means of divine revelation, and ultimately that was only possible by means of the incarnation, Christ himself coming into the world and explaining the Father to us, whom no man had ever seen. This system that was established by Christians in the Middle Ages didn't separate intellectual formation from moral formation. We find in modern society this separating of the intellect with modern schooling and academic pursuits, and then we've got faith formation, or then we've got moral teaching, and we treat these things as if they belong to 2 different spheres, but that's because of our errors in thinking. In the Middle Ages, when Christianity was really directing education and the philosophy of education, that system didn't separate intellectual formation from moral formation. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric shaped the intellect and gave a student the tools to pursue the knowledge of philosophy and theology. And those sciences of philosophy and theology directed the soul to eternal truth. Remember, the perfection of the intellect. And moral training in the virtues through moral philosophy and through divine revelation formed the will to understand and pursue the good. And so here we have truth and goodness pursued by the classical Catholic curriculum. Every part of the curriculum from beginning to end was ordered to man's ultimate end. The entire curriculum of medieval Catholic education was ordered to the fulfillment of man's end, the perfection of the student. And that began in the earliest years of education and continued until death. And we need to learn to think of education not as something you do for a few years until you get your diploma or until you get your degree. We need to learn to understand that as long as we're not perfect, we're in need of education. And there's only one system of education that's capable of leading us from the beginning to the end of that education, and that's the classical Catholic curriculum. Now, in the modern period, and when I say modern period, I'd like to make this clear, because we hear people talk about, in modern times, in modern society, and we don't really know what they're talking about. What exactly do we mean by modern society? To give you a good event in world history to use as the line for modern history, anytime you hear me talk about modern history, it really starts with Christopher Columbus. And I'm not saying that Christopher Columbus did something negative. I'm just saying that's an easy event. Christopher Columbus discovering the New World. Think 1492 or round it off to 1500. That's really where the modern world begins, and things radically change. And you can imagine how radically they would have changed with the discovery of the New World. Just hard to comprehend. But in the modern period, we had a number of movements, or apparent movements, and I'll maybe talk about that a little bit, but we can say that there were a couple of different movements that introduced real changes to that ancient vision of education that was held and continued through Catholic history. The Renaissance identifies as a renewal of some interest in ancient learning when there really was no such thing. The ancient learning had continued in the Catholic tradition. This was a different kind of ancient learning. If we go back to ancient civilization, there were always, just as there are today, there were always two different streams of civilization, two different streams of culture. One was this culture of the virtuous pagan men, the wise men, building upon their learning and their life lessons and experience generation after generation. And we have this whole chain of virtuous pagans: Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca, and so on. But there were also wicked men, false teachers in the ancient world, like the Epicureans, as a good example. And so we had these two different streams of men, the good and the bad, the wise and the foolish, the true and the false teachers, the reasoning men and the sophists. And the Renaissance was really a renewal of interest in those ancient philosophies and philosophers who had been rejected by the virtuous pagans. And again, I mentioned Epicureanism. We'll see if we study the history of philosophy as we get into the modern period, we see what there really is a renewed interest in Epicurean philosophy, which in many ways is seen today in the modern scientific community, and it's unfortunate. But we have the Renaissance starting, let's say, in the 1400s into the 1500s. We also have the scientific revolution starting with some controversial events like the Galileo scandal. But really, I don't want to make it seem like interest in scientific research and investigation it was a bad thing or was opposed by the church, because that's a lie. If you want to learn about this, if you're really serious about learning about Catholic history of science, I recommend you find an author named Pierre Duhem, who was a Catholic scientist and a historian or philosopher of science. Pierre Duhem, D-U-H-E-M. He was French. He wrote a great book, multiple volumes. I think the title of it was The System of the World. He wrote another book titled Medieval Cosmology. And there's another book that he wrote. But his argument was basically that modern science developed out of ancient philosophy and out of scholastic theology, and that there was a steady, unbroken development that led to the scientific method and to true modern science, and that this argument that there was some sort of revolution led by anti-Catholic men that freed the world from ignorance and superstition is just a made-up story, and he documents the historical development of ideas and teachings that led to modern science and show how it perfectly continues from ancient philosophy and medieval Catholicism. But there's this idea that the scientific revolution, which was led by Francis Bacon, who was an anti-Catholic philosopher. I recommend you learn as much as you can about Francis Bacon. He's really the person who leads the abandonment of the ancient system of learning and really establishes the foundation of modern culture, which we live in the presence of today. And then you've got the Protestant schism. So these three movements, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Protestant schism, being just a radical, multi-pronged rebellion against everything true and good from the past. And we can see that this ascending system of learning and virtue is just abandoned in the 15 and 1600s. Humanism severed learning from its theological purpose, and I unfortunately can't get into all of this in one talk. I really recommend, if you're studying in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I really recommend you study our History of Philosophy course that will get into all of this in great detail. It's actually written by a Jesuit philosopher. Very great course or set of courses that you can work through on your own time, at your own pace. But humanism separated learning from its theological purpose, from its true purpose, and treated education as a means to human glory rather than the service of God. And then later, as we get into industrialization and all of the mechanization of the modern world, we have utilitarian philosophers that reduced education to preparation for economic productivity, for being useful. And so we see this abandonment of the true end of education in modern history. We see this turning away from God and seeking the glory of man himself, which, again, we can relate that back to the Renaissance. And we see the abandonment of this supernatural end of human life and learning with a focus on worldly utilitarian ends, which are really just means. And today, in most schools, colleges, and universities, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about secular schools, secular colleges, or Catholic colleges, there's no difference. Truth, I should say, to make this clear, truth is treated as subjective. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're in a secular school or a Christian school. Truth is treated as subjective. There's no respect for authority. There's no recognition of any ultimate truth or authoritative interpreter of either creation or divine revelation. So truth is reduced to something that's subject to human decision, and goodness is redefined in terms of personal preference or social utility. You know, what's good for the community, what works. And again, you can see how that mindset in modern culture was the mindset in my classmates when my professor asked, What would you do to fix education? They just immediately began firing off subjective opinions instead of establishing a true and absolute end and then asking, how can we reach that end? You can see the modern mindset. Look at modern politics. It's so clear. You've got politicians who they would never answer a question about the end or the purpose. They're just talking about policies and programs, and we need new laws because we need this and we need money for this and we need to invest in that. And they can't tell you, though, what the end is that they're pursuing. The same is true in modern science. We can look at someone like Elon Musk and be impressed with his scientific achievements, just like we're impressed with an acrobat or a juggler. We can ooh and ah over these interesting things, but if we really come to our senses and ask the question, what is the end of this? What's the purpose of this? What are you seeking to actually accomplish? We find no answers for those questions of final causes or ends. And that's really the mark of the modern mind. It has no purpose, no end. It's just will, and it's just self-seeking, relativistic, and so on. Education gets reduced to a sort of tool for career advancement or the promotion of a political ideology, very, very short-sighted, present-minded, or just personal entertainment, like the love of reading. Talk about the love of reading. Do you love reading? Our kids love reading. What's the purpose of reading? The purpose of reading is not just to read. And the measure of good education is not just that people like reading. That's like saying I like watching television. The natural and supernatural ends of man are ignored, and education is no longer directed at its proper end, which is the perfection of human nature in the attainment of truth and goodness. In this modern system of education, the intellect is no longer ordered towards truth. The will is no longer disciplined and directed towards the good. And the result is a generation of men and women unformed in reason or virtue, lacking both the knowledge and the moral habits necessary for a truly human life. A human life, not a Christian life, not a Catholic life, a human life. Modern education is not human. That's the problem. This is the problem that I sought to remedy when I founded the Classical Liberal Arts Academy back in 2008. In the Academy, we're working to correct this error by restoring the authentic Catholic understanding of education. That is real human education. Education that actually makes sense after we've accurately defined what a human being is. Our program in the Academy is ordered explicitly toward truth and goodness, as they were understood and explained by Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. We begin, just as they did, with the classical liberal arts: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. And we don't do this as just some sort of museum exercise or antiquarian or nostalgic activity. We do this because this is the proven method for perfecting the intellect. We lead students through the classical liberal arts and into the philosophical sciences, and we want to do this as early as possible. And these form the intellect in what we can call natural truths, that is, truths which are within the reach of human nature. And we seek to form the will in moral virtue by both study and practice. Much of what I have to explain to parents and students has much more to do with our moral lives than any academic activity. Students struggle to make progress not because they intellectually can't handle the content, but because morally they just don't have the discipline to get tasks done that need to be done. Parents struggle to lead their children not because they can't comprehend the end or the means, but because they simply don't have the discipline to do the daily work. True education is not only intellectually challenging, it's also morally challenging. It's very difficult. It takes discipline. We have to be virtuous in order to get a true human education. It's very difficult, very rigorous, requires patience in the sense that there's a lot of work to do that needs to be done consistently over a long period of time. It requires real patience or perseverance. Finally, we lead our students, as we must, into sacred theology. We don't just tack this on in some awkward way. I like to say Velcro on religion to a curriculum that has nothing to do with it. But our entire program, from the earliest lessons in the first subjects all the way through to the end, is a steady and orderly ascent from the most elementary lessons and concepts up into the highest levels of theology, and it's lifelong study. We pursue the study of theology for the sake of knowing, loving, and serving God, which is our true end. And so by restoring this order, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy provides true education. And again, I want to emphasize true human education, as it was understood by wise men and saints in the ancient and medieval world, an education that cultivates human potential, that seeks to lead man to perfection as a rational creature, a man composed of body and soul. This education seeks to lead man to perfection and to prepare him or to dispose him to the hope of eternal life. That's the purpose of true education. I would say that anything less than that is not Christian education, not Catholic education, but I'd go further because I think that falls short of the truth. Anything short of that pursuit of human perfection fails to be true human education. And that's how I really would like us to think about this. We're educating humans. What is true human education? It's to lead human beings to the perfection of their nature, to the fulfillment of their end. Anything less than that doesn't deserve to be called human education, doesn't deserve to be called Christian or Catholic education. And most modern education is not worthy of the name, certainly not sufficient for human education. And that's what we seek to fix in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Truth and goodness, just keep repeating those two virtues, truth and goodness, truth and goodness. These are not just nice things to talk about. They're not optional elements or qualities that might be sought in an educational program. They are the ends of true education. Everything that's done in education is done for the sake of truth and goodness. We're accountable at every point as teachers and parents. If someone were to ask us, how does this lead you forward towards the truth? We should have an answer. How does this lead you to goodness, to the perfection of your will? We should have an answer. We should know the end because, as Aristotle says, the end is like the target that we aim at. Knowing the end, we direct everything at that end. That end is the source of all alignment, not only in school or in education, but in our entire life. If I was to look at my schedule and ask myself, how does this schedule lead me, or how is it leading me towards truth and goodness? If I was to look at your schedule and ask, how is this schedule of yours leading you to truth and goodness, to the perfection of your nature? You need to be able to answer that question or something's wrong. You're like those kids in my class talking about doing all kinds of things, busy, arguing about different ideas without any reference to any end. And you see, that's just all nonsense. The real ends of education are truth and goodness. They're the ends, the purpose. Without truth, the intellect can't be perfected, and truth is found ultimately in Christ himself. Without truth, the intellect can't be perfected, and therefore there is no true education. And without goodness, the will can't be perfected. And again, there can be no true education. Without both of these, man cannot fulfill his nature or reach his final end. Aristotle and Aquinas both teach, and I use Aristotle and Aquinas as representatives of ancient philosophy and of Catholic theology. They both teach that happiness consists in virtue. And the highest virtue is the contemplation of truth, which directs us to the supreme good, which is God himself. Education that ignores this is not just a different kind of education. It's a fundamentally disordered pursuit called education. Really doesn't make any sense. And this is true of almost all modern education. The problem is really that great. The restoration of true education is not about aligning our schooling or curriculum with our religious beliefs. It goes beyond that. It's not just about aligning education with our political convictions. It's not just conservative education, just raising a bunch of little conservative free market capitalists. That's not the purpose of true education. The restoration of true education with its end in God, with the perfection of the intellect in truth and the perfection of the will in goodness, that's the necessary definition of education, human education. Anything less is subhuman. Only by returning to the pursuit of truth and goodness can we form men and women capable of living human lives in this world and attaining eternal life in the next. I don't know how much you watch the news, but when you look at these cities and communities where there's no Christianity, there's no more family structure, when you look at these communities, what we see are creatures living that don't appear to be human. We look at their behavior and we ask, how can they ever be redeemed? They literally live and act like irrational animals, like beasts, like a different species of subhuman animals. And that's what happens when we turn away from true human education. That turn away from true human education didn't happen when Joe Biden was president or when Barack Obama was president. It didn't happen with the sexual revolution of the 1960s. It didn't happen with the flappers in the 1920s. It didn't happen when Darwin proposed the theory of evolution. It didn't happen in Victorian England. The turning away from true human education happened much, much earlier. It happened back at the beginning of modern history, around 1500. The Renaissance, the scientific rebellion, we really should call it, the Protestant schism. That's where society made a left turn and headed down a different road. And what we see today is simply the consequences of those movements. If you look at the collapse of modern society and you start putting the pieces together and ask, how did this come about? And you trace it back to the previous step and you say, how did that come about? And how did that come about? And before that, how did that come about? You will trace that degeneration of human society back to those three movements which marked the beginning of modern history: the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Protestant schism. So to bring this talk to a close here as we approach an hour, the real ends of education are truth and goodness. And just keep reciting truth and goodness, the perfection of the intellect, which is truth, and the perfection of the will, which is goodness. This is not something for children. This is something for every human being from the earliest years of our life until we take our last breath. The effort to work, to reach perfection, to be complete as human beings. That is the work of education. It never can end. The real ends of education are truth and goodness, and that's as they were understood by Aristotle, the representative of ancient philosophy, and of Aquinas, representative of Catholic theology, which have been preserved through history by the Catholic Church. Education exists to cultivate the intellect and the will, so that man may know, love, and serve God and enjoy Him forever in the world to come. You know, I often get questions, I'm sorry to sidetrack here, but I often get contacts from older men, retired men, and they'll ask questions like, is it too late for me to start learning? Is it really worth getting started with classical studies? Where should I begin? And they're sort of depressed and pessimistic. And what I always tell them is, your soul is eternal. Your soul is eternal. Your body may be getting older, your body may be breaking down and weakening, but your soul is going to live forever. Yes, I do think it's worth investing in your soul. Yes, I do. No, I don't think it's too late to invest in your soul. No, I don't think investing in your soul, moving your soul towards perfection by pursuing what is true and good, it can't possibly be too late to do that. It can't possibly be a waste of time to do that. That's your whole purpose. And if you're not perfect, you've got work to do. And education is the means by which we do that work. And of course, it's just a part of the whole Christian life. But it's never too late to invest in your soul, because your soul is going to live forever. And when you die, you're not going to pass through the river that the ancient myths talked about and have your memory erased to prepare you for reincarnation. No, your soul is going to continue when your body falls off, as it were, and decays. Your soul is going to continue. If anything, you should invest in your soul. It's never too late to move towards perfection, because Christ commands you, whether you're 8 years old or 88 years old, Christ says to you the same thing: be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And if we understand these things rightly, that's a call to education. That's a call to study. That's a call to philosophy, theology, self-examination, self-improvement, and so on. Never too late. Ancient and medieval schools served this end. We recognize old men as wise men, not just graduates. But modern schools have abandoned all of this. The modern school curriculum doesn't even have a use in the life of its graduates. We don't find any old men studying public school textbooks. We don't find any old middle-aged businessmen thinking back to their fourth grade lessons and picking them up. The modern school is irrelevant for any purpose beyond getting a diploma or gaining some market skill or some workplace readiness skill. It has no real purpose in the end of human life. But in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we restore that true education. We make it available. And if you look at our program, you'll just see how practical it all is. It's affordable. You can study for free. You can study when you can have your children study when they're 5 years old. You can have your teenagers study. You can study for your entire life in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's the restoration of true education, with the ends being the pursuit of truth and goodness. And so I'd like to invite you to come and check it out, see what I'm talking about. Again, my name is William Michael. I'm the founder of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I still direct it, work around the clock as the headmaster, and study myself. I'm a student in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy myself. There's nothing I would rather do. I've taken classes at Harvard, and there's just no comparison between what's available in modern colleges or universities or study programs and what's available in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. No comparison. And I think you'll see that if you come and join us. You can start for free. You can study as long as you wish for free in our extern study program, where you have access to all of our study materials. If you'd like to take quizzes and submit assignments for grading and keep records of your scores and achievements, you can sign up for a paid study program. There's no limit. There's no limit. It's really up to you what you'd like to do. All of the courses are self-paced. There's no artificial deadlines. Very affordable, as you'll see. And I would love to see you join us and get involved and get in touch and study with us, because together we can work to fulfill this duty to seek perfection of our intellect and will through the study of the classical liberal arts, philosophy, and theology. And we make that available in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, get in touch. Again, the website is classicalliberalarts.com. And you can reach me directly by email if you'd like. Just write to mail, M-A-I-L, at classicalliberalarts.com. God bless.